Welcome to an episode of the podcast Art Insiders New York. My name is Anders Holst. The theme of the podcast is New York, with a focus on behind-the-scenes conversations with fascinating people who are making an impact in the world of art, design, and architecture. Robert Hammond is, together with Joshua David, the co-founder of the Friends of the High Line, the entity that maintains, operates, and creates program for the High Line in partnership with NYC Department of Parks and Recreation. In this interview, Robert tells a thriller-like story with the many twists and turns that arose in protecting, preserving, and reinventing the former Southern Viaduct section of the New York Central Railroad into one of the most successful public attractions in New York City. So, Robert, very welcome to the podcast Art Insiders New York.
Great, thanks for having me here.
Thank you. I read this wonderful book that you have written, Highline, The Inside Story of New York City's Park in the Sky. And I found that it reads like a thriller. You know, there's things happening all the time. You make one step forward and then there's a twist to the left and to the right, and then you have another obstacle and then you go back to, step number one. So I was wondering, when does the movie come out?
I don't know. I feel like that book was the story of sort of when Josh and I started in '99 to when we first opened this first section in 2009.
So there will be a sequel then, part
maybe,
one and
maybe.
part two. You met Joshua David at a community meeting.
Yeah.
Now, so how was that? Did you have the feeling that this was sort of destiny, or was it just a casual thing that you just showed up there and you talked?
Yeah, I mean, I moved to New York in '93, and I lived in the West Village because it was cheap. I got 3 months free rent in my apartment, which is sort of a funny thing now, that idea in the West Village. And then in the summer of '99, I read an article that said the High Line was going to be demolished.
Yeah.
And I had, seen it from the street and thought it was cool, didn't think that much of it. But then I thought, oh, wow, maybe there must be a group trying to preserve it and I can help out or, help raise money or something. And asked around, no one was doing anything. And then I heard it was on the agenda for a community board meeting. Never been to a community board meeting. Yeah. Actually came back, I was on vacation out at Fire Island, came back early to attend this community board meeting. And I was sitting next to a guy that I didn't know. Yeah. And at the end of the meeting, everyone was either in favor of demolishing it or just didn't care, except this other guy sitting next to me. So we exchanged business cards, and I say, I'm really busy, you do it. And he said, I'm busy, you do it. and that was Joshua David. And so that was the beginning of this.
So have you thought about that time, looking back at it? If you had taken another subway, or if you had gotten delayed, you hadn't been there, do you think you would still be here today?
No.
Somehow it seems like you have a great chemistry together. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I don't think either one of us would have done it. One would have tried to do it or would have been able to do it if we hadn't done it together. And the other thing I just want to say, and I'll go back to your answer, is Josh and I get a lot of credit for this. It was also, I feel like my biggest skill is finding a lot of smart people to come together to help us get this done. And what was interesting was that neither Josh nor I had any experience in this. People assume we're architects or designers. Yeah. My background, I was a history major. At the time, I was working, doing marketing for some internet startups. I was a part-time artist. Yeah. No experience in architecture, design, or planning. And Joshua was a travel writer, so he didn't have any experience. And when we first started talking to people about it, that was one of the big things they said. We were like, well, one, what do you want to do with it? And we said, we don't know, because we didn't have, we weren't designers, we weren't architects, we didn't have a plan. Yeah. And that we didn't have any relevant experience, we didn't have any money to build it, and we really didn't have a coherent plan in the beginning. Yeah. But all of those things proved to be actually sort of the secrets of success. And Josh was, because he was a travel writer, he was a great writer, had a lot of contacts in the press. So that was some of the things he started working. He also had done an article about all the new galleries in the neighborhood. And that's where he first saw he lived in the neighborhood, but he first sort of noticed the High Line when he was doing this article. So he went back to all these galleries for support of this project. And my background was in marketing. So, I mean, one of the first things I did was get Paula Scheer to design our logo.
Yeah.
We started a Yahoo e-group, which was a very early listserv, because I was working in what was then called the .com, era. So we were, using email in a different way that most preservation groups weren't doing. And just to keep in mind, I mean, Google was a year old when we started.
Yeah.
So, it took us 10 years from when we first met to when we opened the first section of the Highline.
So that is then 20 years ago then, basically.
Yeah, this is our 20-year anniversary, exactly.
I see. You are very modest and candid about your role in this whole project. In the times that we live in, that's very refreshing, I think. And there are some other founders too. You mentioned that you almost had a third founder, Joel.
Well, Joel Sternfeld was a photographer. So when we went up there, we took pictures, again, with cameras. There were no camera phones then. And just took pictures, and they weren't that good. It looked like a whole bunch of weeds growing on a railroad track that you find that all over the country.
Yeah.
And so but this feeling up there was really magical. So someone suggested this photographer, Joel Sternfeld. I didn't know him, looked him up in literally the white pages, called him up, got him to come up there. He said, wow, don't let anyone up here for a year, and I'll give you incredible photos. It turns out he was a very famous artist and photographer.
Yeah.
And he photographed the Highline for a year and came back with these incredible photos that really captured sort of the mystery, the beauty, and those photos we learned was our best sales technique. At meetings, we learned to talk less and show more of these photos.
Yeah.
Because what it did is people looked at the photo and they would imagine different things. So some people imagined, wow, that's a great site for architecture. Some people said, wow, this is native grasses. Wow, this is rail history. Wow, this is about planning. This is a space for mobility. I mean, and so it created a really large group of supporters that enabled us in the early days. Because the other thing that's hard to remember is, and for hard people to understand, there was a lot of opposition.
Yeah.
No one was for this thing in the beginning.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't that we just had to come up with a good idea. We had to fight, Mayor Giuliani. The mayor at the time wanted to tear it down, and now, of course, he's the biggest villain in the world, so it's easy to imagine. But then he was a, relatively popular mayor among some people, never me. But
that is true.
And he signed a demolition order 2 days before he left office. And the two mayors before him, and I never like to defend Giuliani, but the two mayors before him were also in favor of demolition.
Yeah.
The property owners underneath it, all the developers in the neighborhood wanted to tear it down. So also a big irony, because the people that have benefited the most are developers and property owners under it. But at the time, they thought it was an eyesore. They thought we would never be successful, these two guys with no money, no experience. And they just wanted to tear it down. So, and even people in the community felt like it was an eyesore. It was rusty. They thought it was dangerous underneath.
What I learned about this thing, though, was that he had signed the demolition order. One of the last things that Giuliani did before he left office.
Yeah, because he knew Mayor-elect Bloomberg, who was going to replace Giuliani, had already said, so it had announced his support for the project. Yeah. All of the candidates running for mayor, we had gotten them to support the project. So he knew Bloomberg was going to support it. So he signed the demolition order literally days before he left, binding the new administration to demolition.
Yeah, because you can't change that.
It's very hard to change once. You can't reverse policy like that. And so it took, and the Bloomberg administration was supportive, but then 9/11 had happened. They had a lot of other much bigger priorities.
Yeah.
And it took us a while to really convince them this really made sense. And then when they got on board, the Bloomberg administration really got on board.
Yeah.
And this never would have happened without that administration. without that kind of vision and that kind of risk taking. And it really became, I think, a great example of a public-private partnership. Yeah. This private group of citizens and community members and the mayor and the whole, all different levels of city administration that made it happen.
And it seems an important thing here, I think you alluded to that before, is that it wasn't like that you had a very clear vision that you tried to convince everybody else to jump in on. It was more like an organic, because then you had this ideas competition, and you sort of worked, opening up a big, perspective on things, and then slowly narrowing it down to what this could be. Yeah. Now, you did a feasibility study, though, that was very important. Yeah. Could you help me to on the one hand side, tell me what was the feasibility? What did it say in terms of number of visitors, or what it would cost to do this, and where we are today with
Yeah. So again, 9/11 played a really critical factor in this, and I watched the towers fall, and selfishly one of my thoughts was, well, there goes the High Line, because who's going to care about this project that's most people thought was just this fantasy when the city's falling apart and everyone's fleeing the city, and I think that was one of the issues for Bloomberg. And so we hired a guy named John Alschuler, who has a firm called HR&A, to do an economic feasibility study. And what it set out to prove is that the benefits to the city in new property taxes over 20 years would be far greater than the costs of building it. And we said, look, we'll raise, if the city supports it, we'll raise a majority of the money to build it. The city doesn't even have to pay for all of it. So the study came back and said that it would cost about $50 million to build, and that it would create $250 million in incremental tax revenues.
Over 20 years?
Over 20 years. Okay. Now, when we did that study, I never really believed it. I was like, maybe it'll create $100 million. Yeah. We just updated that study, and the city, not in the total property development that's happened, but the city will see about $1.5 billion in new tax revenues over 20 years. And right now, the city is getting about $60 million every year in incremental that goes to pay for firefighter school and everything else that the city does. Now, we also got the cost wrong. Mm-hmm. It cost about $250 million. Okay. The city put in ultimately, the city and the federal government put in about $100 million, and we raised the rest privately. But the other thing, just going back to 9/11, and is that one of the things the Bloomberg administration, a priority for them was not just economic development, but how does the city sort of rebuild? How does the city get even better? Yeah. And it was, they had this, in some kind of this window to do projects that maybe wouldn't have happened, otherwise. Mm-hmm. And in this effort to, how does New York keep getting better? Yeah. And that was the spirit. And again, the High Line was a huge risk for the city. Again, it's paid off, so it looks like, wow, that was an easy decision, but it was a lot of money to put into a project that most people thought wouldn't work. They had to fight the development community to get it done. They let us pick a design team that was led by the two firms that we picked had never built really any substantial buildings or parks. Yeah. I mean, now they've gone on to build incredible things, but both the landscape architect and the architectural firm didn't have a big body of work. I mean, they were more known for their conceptual, sort of out there, thoughts. Exactly. And creative ideas rather than very practical solutions. So we had a unlikely project, a sort of what was then a risky design team, and we didn't have the money to build it, and then we didn't have the experience of operating it, because we said, look, we're going to operate it for you, the city, so the city doesn't have to pay to operate it. Yeah, yeah. So that was a lot of risks to take. Yeah.
But can you explain to me then? So there were property owners here, and you have this High Line here, and you wanted to keep it, but these property owners, they wanted to get rid of it because they wanted to, of course, build the property there. So you had this formula that you developed where you used the rights of developing above the highland that could be sort of transacted to other properties around. Can you explain how that works?
So it was a very complicated real estate problem, and that's one of the reasons it had not already been demolished. Because the railroad, CSX, owned the structure itself and a 20-foot easement above the High Line.
Okay.
But they didn't own the property rights underneath the High Line, and they didn't own the air rights above it, above 20 feet above the rail bed. So property owners, there were 22 property owners that owned property along. The railroad owned no property. So there were 22 property owners that owned property underneath the High Line. They could build a building beneath it. They could build a building around it. But it was very impractical. You know, it has tons of columns, so it was very hard to build under it. And it was expensive to build around it, and everyone just assumed it would be demolished anyway. So it created this strip through the neighborhood where there was really no development because everybody was just waiting for it to be demolished. And the reason it wasn't demolished is it was going to be very expensive to demolish it. You know, it had lead paint, it had asbestos, it had to be remediated, and they had to remove this giant steel structure. And so the railroad didn't want to pay for it to be demolished. So they were telling the property owners, you pay for it to be demolished and we'll demolish it. The property owners were saying, you demolish it. And so that's where we came in, and with the Bloomberg administration proposed a transfer of development rights. So it allows, normally in New York, you can only transfer your development rights to your neighbor. If your neighbor doesn't need those rights, they're worthless. So one of the most famous example of this is Grand Central. So the two ways Grand Central was saved, it was declared a landmark, they also created transfer of development rights. So the railroad that owned Grand Central at the time, New York Central, could transfer those development rights anywhere around it. That's why there are a whole bunch of tall buildings around Grand Central. And that's what was proposed in this area, is it enabled them to create what was an impediment to them developing their site to developing anywhere around it. Now, one of the other reasons the property owners were fighting it, and Giuliani wanted to tear it down, is they had just recently rezoned 6th Avenue. And you know, now when you drive up 6th Avenue, there are these huge tall buildings with these giant bases that are like block to block. The High Line prevented that size of a building, of having this corridor of buildings. And so, which I think has been a good thing. I mean, one of the other things that the rezoning did is it kept the building heights relatively low in the middle of the High Line, where it's next to the historic district, and the taller buildings are to the north and south. The other thing it did is it included provisions for affordable housing, and right now I think about 900 units of affordable housing have been created. I can come back to some of the biggest, I don't know, if mistakes or things we could have done differently if we had known, because that's great that all those units have been created, but a lot more could have been created if we had known how successful it was going to become.
This was somewhat inspired by Promenade Plantée in Paris, even though it's not the same thing, but it was something that was an inspiration way back. So what made you pick the architects and the firm that did all the plantings and so on?
Well, just going back to the Paris. So we went to Paris and looked at the Promenade Plantée, and we realized that is not what we wanted to do. I mean, it was nice. It was a nice Parisian park. It has a bench and a bush and a chair. I mean, it's, stair up to it. But it wasn't special. And I think Josh and I felt, and the people that were supporting us, if we're going to win this battle, we don't want to just put a bench up there and put a bed of tulips. We wanted to do something really special. And the other thing that the Joel Sternfeld pictures did is people were really fell in love with this natural wildscape that had grown up there.
It is incredible.
But we knew we had to remove it all, to remove the lead paint, remove the asbestos, remove all, and so you couldn't just leave it as it was. You had to create something new. So first we did an ideas competition in 2003, because even with the support of the Bloomberg administration, we didn't have any money to build it. We were still fighting lawsuits from the property owners. They were suing us and the city. And no one even knew what the High Line was. If you said the High Line, no one knew what it was. And even if you lived next to it, you had no idea. I would say, oh, the thing that you walk under that's dark, and they'd say, oh yeah, the thing where pigeons shit on you. I'd say, yes, that's the High Line. So we did this ideas competition with the idea of just spreading the word about it. And in the brief, we said the ideas didn't have to be realistic. So, and we got a lot of criticism for that, because even I remember some of the elected officials said, well, no one thinks this is a real thing anyway, and you're going to get a whole bunch of crazy ideas. No one's ever going to believe it. And we did. The winner was, one of them was a mile-long lap pool. Yeah. The other one was a urban roller coaster. Another one was creating, they just weren't, couldn't build, they were wonderful ideas, but they weren't realistic. Yeah. And so people would say, well, why this isn't going to help your cause? But what it did is it really put the High Line on the map. Yeah. And we had entries it was the largest ideas competition at the time, and we had entries from all over the world, and it really put it sort of on the map of people. And we had an exhibition at Grand Central, sort of to say, okay, this is not just a local project. This is a citywide project. And then a year later, we had made some progress. The city council, under Speaker Gifford Miller, had allocated our first allocation of money, $15 million, towards construction. Yeah. So we felt comfortable enough to do a design competition. And we had 4 finalists. Zaha Hadid, Michael van Valkenburg, a great landscape architect, Stephen Hall, a great architect who actually his first project in 1990 was about building housing on the High Line, and his offices overlooked the High Line. He sort of had the deepest history. Yeah. And then the team led by a landscape architect, James Corner, field operation, the architects Dillers, Scofidio, and Renfro, and the planting designer Pete Uldoff. And James Corner, there were no gardens we could visit that he designed. He had written several books. He was head of the landscape school at Penn. Yeah. Dillers, Scofidio had built this Blur building that was basically building made of fog that was open for a month. They had a solo show at the Whitney, about barely any. It was called like Aberrant Architecture, and it was basically sort of set designs and art that they had done. Yeah. Pete, the garden designer, had actually built the most of them. Yeah. Now they had been selected to do. James Corner had been selected to do Fresh Kills, and Dillers, Scofidio, and Renfro had been selected to do Lincoln Center, but they hadn't done those things. Yeah. So that's where the city, I think, maybe would have chose someone differently, but they supported, they supported us in taking this risk and going with the most unproven design team. And of course, what they did was magical.
It was one thing I saw in this book that I read that I really like. Rick Scofidio said that my job as an architect is to save the High Line from architecture. Yeah. So was this the kind of thing that attracted you?
Yes.
To these guys?
And at the competition interview, they started arguing with each other. Yeah. And they started arguing with us, because what I liked is that they weren't trying to just put one solution. And they really they got the magic, but they also got, you couldn't just rebuild it exactly as it was. Yeah. That you needed, in some ways, I was reading the book The Leopard at the time, and there's this quote, for everything to stay the same, everything has to change. Yeah. And sort of, to keep the magic, everything had to change, and you had to have a different kind of magic, and that's what they created. It's very different than what it was like when we used to go up there. But that's what I think they did. They figured out, Also that the High Line is not an escape from the city. I think sort of the old tradition of parks or Central Park is you're meant to be out in the wilderness.
Yeah.
For people that couldn't afford to leave the city, you get to be in the country with just going to a park. And the High Line's really different. It's not an escape from the city. It's part of the city. You can see, smell, hear the city.
Yeah.
It's this idea of nature integrated with the urban environment instead of trying to pretend you've left it.
Yeah, and then you're traveling in this environment where you don't have to be worried that you're going to get killed by anything. You're totally protected, and you can walk there. You don't have to. The traffic is not a problem. So it is a really magic place. And I think that I saw also a quote from Liz Diller when she said it was illicit, mysterious, hidden, secret, and dark. And so it is interesting that on every turn here you sort of avoided a standard solution. Instead, there was always this searching for something that I find very interesting. And also there's a funny story about Ed Norton. So did you know him before?
No. Edward read an article. There was an article in the New Yorker. Basically, it wasn't even about us or the High Line. It was about Joel Sternfeld's photographs of the High Line. Adam Gopnik wrote it, and it was more about like Joel taking these photos, and it was. It didn't. The High Line was not likely to happen then, but it caught Edward's attention. He used to live right down below it, and he would sit on his roof drinking beers and throwing beer cans on the High Line. And so he was just interested. He called up like 3 Joshua Davids until he got our Joshua David. And halfway through the conversation, Joshua was like, "Are you that Edward Norton?" Yeah. And he was like, "Yes." And the interesting thing is, father helped start Rails to Trails, which was the legal mechanism we used to make this into a park eventually. And his grandfather was a really innovative developer. Yeah. So he had this history, and I think a lot of times celebrities get involved in, I don't know, you pay for them to come to your event or something, or they show up. But like Edward made phone calls, showed up at community events, gave money. Again, I've never heard of any other celebrity that actually supports a cause and gives money, or rarely, Yeah. And so, and another interesting, Kevin Bacon, whose father was a famous urban planner, and he read about it and got in touch. He and his wife. So we're really lucky on that front.
But I love the story when it was Ed and you, right? That went up there and crawled underneath underneath the fence, because it was blocked off, and then. He did the same thing with Brad Pitt a couple of days later.
Yeah, Edward did. He didn't invite us on that trip.
No, I didn't. Yeah. I thought that was a great story.
Edward snuck up there on his own, yeah.
Now, design seems to be a very important thing that has been with you all the way from the beginning. There is some discussions in the book about thoughtful design and thoughtful planning.
It goes back to one of the first things we did is get a logo, because we didn't have a lot going for us in the beginning. And so we put a lot of attention into the design of our invites and our website, and as sort of a commitment that design was going to be important as we go all the way through. And one of our opponents, who was who worked for Giuliani at a meeting, said that all this project is 2 guys and a logo.
Yeah.
And he meant it as derogatory, but 2 guys in a logo can do a lot.
Yeah. How do you make decisions around design?
Originally, we had a group that was a working group made up of people from the community board, people from the city, elected officials, members of our board, that were working with the design team. And, we had a great staff person, a guy named Peter Mullen, who was an architect, working for the High Line, but he wasn't designing it. So he was working with the design team to help them. And the other thing we did is we had dozens of community input sessions. Yeah. So we made the designers meet with the community before they started, multiple times during the process, Then before we started, because the Highline was done in phases at each phase.
Yeah.
But I think now, I think it's shifted. I think if the first 10 years was a lot about design, the 10 years that followed were really about people and how people use it. And I think that's our focus has changed dramatically. And it goes back to one of the things, I think one of the biggest lessons to take away from the Highline for other projects of something we didn't get right is once you create the value, you can't capture it back. So we created tremendous value for the city and for property owners. That has not necessarily benefited from everyone that lives in the neighborhood. And so now the people that are buying property next to the Highline are probably going to lose money. So you have an opportunity before this project was built to capture more of that value for things like affordable housing.
I see.
And so I think if we had known how successful it was going to be, we could have done that. And that's, I think, the lesson that other projects can learn from us.
Yeah. Because today it's much more than a park, because you have art that we can talk about, you have public programming, you have learning, you have civic engagements and other things. So is that the way that you're trying now to be more inclusive in terms of bringing in people?
Yeah, I think one of the things, just because you have a lot of community input sessions doesn't mean everyone's going to feel welcome. And just because it's open and free doesn't mean everyone's going to feel welcome. And you have to do a lot more, and that's something we learned the hard way. Is when we opened, even though there's 2 large low-income public housing projects in the neighborhood. We even had our offices in one of them for several years when we were starting. We did a lot of community outreach there. But when we opened, very few people were coming that were our most direct neighbors.
Yeah.
And when we did a survey there, they said they didn't come because they felt like it wasn't built for them. They didn't see people that looked like them, and they didn't like our programs. So we had to rethink our programs. When we asked what did they want, they wanted jobs for teens. So we started a teen employment program. They helped create programs on the Highline themselves. And I think we've made progress there. The Highline is more diverse from when we opened. Among New Yorkers, when we opened, it was about 22% people of color. Now it's over 40%. We still have a long way to go. But I think where we can have, but we're not gonna, now that it's done, we're not gonna move the needle very much on affordable housing. And so where we can have the most impact is in helping other projects see that lesson. And we started something called the Highline Network, which is a network of other infrastructure reuse projects all over the country.
Yeah.
And the goal is not, it's called the Highline Network, but it's not to do it how we've done it. In some ways it's like learn from our mistakes, but it's also more importantly, how do we learn from each other?
Yeah.
Because I think other projects have done a better job of this. There's a project in Washington called the 11th Street Bridge that started its basis, instead of basing it in design, although they have a great design by Rem Koolhaas, they started with an equitable development plan on how you can preserve the housing and culture of the Anacostia neighborhood in Washington, D.C., whether this bridge is built or not.
Yeah.
And so in the Beltline, they also, in Atlanta, they have an equitable development plan that has had successes and failures. But, I think that's the important thing, is how do we learn from each other? This is a new field. These are, and because we're neither fish nor fowl, we're part park, part museum, part botanical garden, part social service organization, part public square. And so we have more to learn from each other in some ways as we continue to develop and change.
Yeah. But New York is very special, though, in this. I think it's mentioned in the book that real estate drives New York to a very big extent. I mean, have you thought about what you could have done here? I mean,
I think that's it. Is you couldn't have done it. Property values even then were too expensive. It's not like we could have bought. You could have, but it would have made, it would have been so expensive to buy property adjacent to the Highline. Yeah. But what we could have done is through public action and zoning,
Yeah.
you could have created more affordable housing.
I see. In the outset of the negotiation.
But you would have
couldn't-
had to do it at the beginning, and
Yeah.
in the defense of the city at the time, no one knew. People just did not think. No one was saying this is going to be a big success at the time.
Yeah.
And so that's what we've done is we've proven these can be economic successes,
Yeah.
and so people can learn from our lessons.
I see. It's an incredibly complex project, the High Line, to create this. There's a lot of stakeholders. And I think that you did a really great job in mobilizing a lot of different resources on your end. You know, the local community, celebrities, politicians, and everybody that you need on your side. And I'm thinking about also the fact that you brought these people together and made it work. And I'm thinking that is an incredibly important role to play. And I was thinking maybe this goes back to your own personality, that you are actually a meditation teacher, a painter, entrepreneur. You understand the creative process.
Yeah.
You understand many of these different aspects of what it's like to run a project like this.
I'm not really an expert in anything. I think one of my biggest talents is finding smart people and getting them excited about working on something and taking their advice. I think my second biggest talent is false modesty. So, which is
they go together.
Yeah, well, no, but it's being able to. I think that's why sometimes if these projects are led by architects, it's harder because then people don't really often want to just help realize your idea. They want to help realize their own idea. And this really did. Josh and I didn't have a vision for exactly what it was going to be. And so I think a lot of people were able to feel that they were realizing their own vision, which they were.
Yeah. So what's on your to-do list? I mean, when you come into the office, today is Friday, what are the things that you're dealing with?
Yeah, I can tell you, I had a meeting about this Highline Network. We have a meeting next week, a gathering of 50 industrial reuse projects from all over the country. It's the largest gathering of these kind of projects together. We're meeting for 2 days at the Ford Foundation, so spend some of my time on that. Spend some of my time on fundraising.
Yeah.
So we have an $18 million budget, and we only get a few $100,000 from the city for our annual operating budget.
I see.
So we have to raise all of that every year.
$18 million every year.
Yeah. So, and we get members. People come members at starting at $40. That's a lot. We do events. We have a board. Foundations. So I would say fundraising is a big piece. But I think the real thing is what interests me is really thinking about the future. I mean, I think, we talked about the opportunity for other projects, but I think what our opportunity here is, one, continuing to make sure people feel welcome.
Yeah.
And that I think we do through our programming for kids, adults, teens, the art. But then also the neighborhood has changed dramatically in the past, not just 10 years, but 5 years, 1 year. With the opening of Hudson Yards, I think people are getting a feeling of what's happening in this neighborhood. And what has been built now is only a fraction of what's coming.
Yeah.
Hudson Yards is going to double on the Western Rail Yards. There's Hudson Boulevard. There's Manhattan West. You're going to see millions and millions, tens of millions, probably 20 million more square feet of development happening in this neighborhood. And that has huge repercussions. And some of them good, but a lot of them not good. And so, our role is not going to be a leader, but I think what we can do is we can connect people.
Yeah.
And how do we make sure this sort of fabric of this neighborhood is not completely ripped apart? I think it is already ripped and ripping because few neighborhoods have gone through this kind of just seismic change so fast and having such disparity of wealth. You can have a $50 million apartment in a Zaha Hadid building across the street from public housing where the average income of a family of 4 is $24,000.
Yeah.
And there's very little connection between all of these different communities within one neighborhood. And so I think that's the challenge is one, how do we help like move people physically around these neighborhoods in public space? Because a lot of the spaces that are being created are meant to serve commercial purposes.
Yeah. Getting
people to go to a mall or helping office buildings or, and so how do you help the people that live here and New Yorkers? And then the other thing that's like non-physical is how do you connect all of the economic and cultural resources in the neighborhood with each other? And it's not about, giving money or jobs to poor people. It's, Hudson Yards would benefit from more connections with neighbors and so again, it's us being part of those, and I think we're going to have the most impact by partnering with the other cultural and organization and businesses in the neighborhood. And so we're literally playing the role of a civic connector, both physically and in the non-physical realms.
Yeah. And that's a huge challenge because there's been some criticism of the Hudson Yards being for the top 1%.
Yeah, no, I think I look back, because our 20-year anniversary, I was looking back at these Joel Sternfeld photos, and I was thinking, why did I fall in love with the High Line? And part of it was these juxtapositions of the hard and the soft, the man-made and the nature, and the beautiful and the ugly. And I think when people looked at these Joel Sternfeld photos, or when they came on the High Line, different people saw beauty and ugly in different things.
Yeah.
Some people hated the billboards. There were billboards all over the High Line and buildings in the neighborhood. I love the billboards.
Yeah.
Some people looked at the High Line and saw weeds. Some people saw wildflowers. And I think that's still true today. I think when people, and I take so many people on tours of the High Line, and people see beauty and ugliness in completely different things. Yeah. I mean, people's reactions to Hudson Yards is all over the place.
It's true.
And I think that's part of the city. That's part of the nature of living in the city. But I think what our role is how do we as an organization keep evolving to meet the changing needs of the people living in these neighborhoods and people living in New York in general.
So you have a role to play as some kind of an integrator here.
Yeah, I think it's a connector. I like that. I like that term, civic connector, and civic meaning not like a grand civic building, but like your own neighborhood, your own city, and cities in general. I think we have a lot to learn from what other cities are doing too.
Yeah, I understand. Well, Robert, thank you so much for taking the time.
Great.
And for this conversation about the High Line, an incredibly successful project here in New York that we're very proud of. Even though, as with everything else, there are positives and negatives, but it's overwhelmingly positive, I think.
Great.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
This is Art Insiders New York. My name is Anders Holst. Thank you for listening, and be sure to visit www.artinsidersnewyork.com to join the conversation and subscribe to the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode of the Art Insiders New York podcast, head over to iTunes if you're not already there to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It is very much appreciated. Thank you. This episode was produced by UOM LLC, copyright 2019.